In the spring of 1839, Joseph Nicollet prepared for his most ambitious expedition to date. With his mapping of Cherokee lands in the south, and more recently a map of the Mississippi, St. Croix, Namakagon, Minnesota, Cannon, Le Sueur, and the Blue Earth River, Mankato, Nicollet nevertheless prepared for an even more dangerous trip, the Missouri River.
Scientifically, the upper Missouri River was mostly filled with rumor and hyperbole, a land of volcanoes, vast deserts, and endless seas of grass, inhabited by the greatest Indian nation on the continent, the Oceti-Sakowin, the Sioux. Personally, Nicollet fixated on the legends of his countrymen, Pierre Charles Le Sueur and Baron Lahontan. Although Nicollet should have felt confident about finding Le Sueur's legendary fort in Hilliard, the details of Lahontan's Long River did not match what Nicollet found in southern Minnesota. Was the Missouri the mysterious Long River? If so, would it hold the mysteries described by his countrymen? Or perhaps match the quest of the Chippewas' Seven Fires Exodus? Or the secrets of the Dakota's Spirit Lake?
On April 6, 1839, Nicollet departed St. Louis on the steamship Antelope with his trusted companions John C. Fremont, the famed Jesuit missionary Peter de Smet, botanist Carl Geyer, and 5 professional voyagers to study the Missouri River. Joseph Nicollet was born into the chaos of the French Revolution, and as an adult, he lost his position and home during the July Revolution of 1830. Instead of leaving him bitter and jaded, Nicollet came out of his turmoil with even greater compassion for his fellow human, regardless of nationality, religion, or race.
As a student and friend of global explorer Alexander von Humboldt, Nicollet came to America knowing the plight of the indigenous tribes. His initial contact came when he mapped Cherokee lands in Georgia shortly before state and federal troops forcibly removed America's most civilized and peaceful nation in a scandal later known as the Trail of Tears. In 1835, he met the Potawatomi refugees from Michigan who attempted to adjust to farming along the edge of the prairie. From 1836 to 1838, Nicollet lived with the Anishinaabe and Dakota tribes who were on the brink of signing treaties for their own protection.
At Fort Snelling, Nicollet met the slave Dred Scott, who served the fort doctor. But only 3 years later, he met Scott again, now property of John F.A. Sanford, who traveled on the steamship to Nebraska.
Nicollet's other traveling companion, Father de Smet, was the polar opposite of a slave owner. De Smet followed the Potawatomi, who were moved from St. Louis to a new reservation at Council Bluffs. After a month of traveling with de Smet, Nicollet noted, "But the people of the United States pay little attention to federal laws and treaties when it is to their advantage to nullify them. A native breathing the air of natural liberty placed against a nation with civil and republican liberties," Nicollet mocked. Little did the military agents who hired Nicollet to produce maps know that Nicollet would soon become a champion for the dignity of all Native American tribes. Even though Nicollet's career began as a renowned astronomer and expert on Halley's Comet, which appeared in late 1835, the boy genius redefined himself as a scientist following his midlife crisis in France. In America, he gained acclaim as a meteorologist, cartographer, mathematician, anthropologist, and on the Missouri, the first geologist to study the hostile lands. On April 27th, Nicollet noted and collected countless marine fossils that would preview the later discovery of even more impressive dinosaur fossils far upstream in the Badlands. Like a modern-day forensic scientist, Nicollet analyzed the sediment of countless creeks and rivers, especially those with purported volcanoes, which Nicollet downgraded to pseudo-volcanoes because there are no volcanoes in South Dakota.
So what were the smoke clouds seen by the fur traders? The sulfurous fumes? Nicollet found burned hills, which lent themselves to the French word brûle, but the land of volcanoes was disproven. In Nicollet's journal entries, his obsession with Lahontan and Le Sueur could be seen when he noted the contents of Weeping Water Creek, which now is called Table Creek in Otto County, a bank of blue clay of the same thickness as the preceding one, and surmounting it. As one breaks open the rock, one can also extract fragments belonging to both kinds.
The scientists clearly understood the river did not contain copper, yet the adventurer would have held out hope to find the Great Divide shown on Lahontan's map. The Missouri River in 1839 was much different than the modern river, which is wider and deeper thanks to a series of dams. For Nicollet, the sandbars and frequent snags from submerged trees added countless days to the trip. On March 9th, at the delta of the Big Sioux River, they met their first delay. Again, on March 26th, they got stuck at Three Islands, near Gregory County, and had to work for 3 more days before they could free the ship.
After passing present-day Chamberlain, they ran aground twice more on the Big Bend, until an 8-inch rain made it possible to finally reach the outpost of Fort Pierre after traveling 70 days and covering 1,200 miles. Nicollet wrote, "We arrived at Fort Pierre, built on a large and beautiful meadow between the hill and the west bank of the Missouri."
Fort Pierre, as all South Dakota residents call it, was built in 1832 by Pierre Chateau Jr., son of the French Creole fur trader who helped establish St. Louis as the gateway of the West.
Pierre Jr., who befriended Nicollet years earlier when he first arrived in St. Louis, pioneered the use of steamships to expand the arm of Ramsey Crook's American Fur Company beyond the depleted lands of the Great Lakes and into the Rocky Mountains.
By 1839, Fort Pierre was already a new gateway to the Northwest. Upon arrival, Willie Dixon and John Fremont prepared the wagons and supplies to continue the expedition by land.
While Nicollet waited, he studied the sediment coming out of the mythical Badlands, which was then described as the Great American Desert, and was rumored to be as vast as the African Sahara. From what Nicollet found, he had evidence to contradict the rumors, and even held out hope that the lands could one day sustain farming.
Now, instead of following the Long River to its headwaters, Nicollet chose 2 other motives: seeking a New Spirit Lake, or Devil's Lake, and meeting Chief Wahanaton and the Yankton tribe, who still roamed free upon the prairies.
After leaving the Missouri River, Nicollet's expedition crossed into the open prairies of the Yankton tribe of present-day South Dakota.
With the help of veteran guide Willie Dixon, Nicollet had no problems with the people labeled as the vile and warlike Sioux by Lewis and Clark and tribes east of the Mississippi River.
Instead, Nicollet found a small village of 100 people living in 11 lodges led by the Eagle Chief, whom he described as one of the most intelligent and brave Indians with whom I have ever become acquainted.
The Eagle Chief gave Nicollet advice on the safest routes and sent him on his way. On July 10th, Nicollet arrived at the Jock River, now known as the James River, at a cluster of oaks. He was supposed to meet with reinforcements from Grenville's outpost at Lac qui Parle. But after waiting 3 days, the smaller party headed north to the lands of mighty Chief Wahnata, who camped near a place described by Willie Dixon as Devil's Lake. Biographers who chronicled the life of the famed scientist noticed how elusive, sporadic, and uninspired his notes were on the 1839 trip when compared to his earlier expeditions. While a full exploration of the Missouri River all the way to the headwaters in the Canadian Rockies fueled Nicollet even up to the days prior to his sudden death, it was Devil's Lake, not the headwaters, that would be his final exploration.
The first reason Nicollet came to Devil's Lake was to meet with the great Sioux chief Wahnata. Just as Shagobay was an asset to understanding the customs of the Chippewa, Wahnata allowed Nicollet to learn the customs of the Sioux, a generation before they'd be pressured into changing their ways and adopting a reservation lifestyle.
While his apprentice, John Fremont, took measurements of Devil's Lake,
Nicollet spent time with the chief, observing ancient rituals. Devil's Lake was also the last attempt by Nicollet to find either a spirit lake or a turtle island. Although a few Chippewa bands pressed into North Dakota, still looking for their elusive seventh stopping place, most Chippewa remained convinced Turtle Island was located in Minnesota.
Nicollet also seemed convinced that Devil's Lake was neither Spirit Lake nor was it the watershed described by Wahnata as the River of Death.
A few years later, at his offices in Washington, D.C., Nicollet discreetly solved the riddles by placing the location of the Long River in southern Minnesota, with clues such as the Le Sueur River, the Blue Earth River, the Lahontan River, and the Undine. Although X marks the spot for the mystery of the Lahontan and Le Sueur's Blue Earth, there is little to indicate that Nicollet ever found the location of Turtle Island or the location of the real Spirit Lake.
Devil's Lake, it took Nicollet another week before he returned to the Coteau de Prairie, where he was able to take his time exploring the place where the water flowed in all directions. At Lake Traverse, he parted way with the horses and wagons and sent them back to the fort with his guide Willie Dixon. Switching back to river travel, they cut down two 36-foot canoes from massive cottonwood trees. After 3 days traveling from Lake Traverse, Big Stone, and Marsh Lake, Nicollet reunited with Joseph Grenville at his cabin at Lac qui Parle.
On September 10th, 1839, after 5 days on the river, the canoe armada reached the Cottonwood River near present-day New Ulm. During the previous year, he met with Chief Sleepy Eyes and numerous villages of friendly Sisseton Indians in the area, whom he vaccinated for smallpox, and in turn, they stuffed Nicollet with roasted duck. A generation later, the Dakota conflict of 1862 would see violence and destruction come to the Cottonwood Delta as promises made in the days of Nicollet crumbled away. But in 1839, white fur traders and the Dakota lived side by side. Joseph Laframboise, Nicollet's guide during the 1838 expedition, met there with Nicollet. Although Minnesota would not become a state for a few decades, Joseph Laframboise was the closest thing Minnesota had to a governor at the time. Laframboise was born into a fur trading family at Mackinac Island, and as a young man, established relationships with the Chippewa in Wisconsin and the Ree, or Arikara, on the upper Missouri. In fact, it was Laframboise who established the first fur trading outpost and would later become Fort Pierre.
By land and by water, the frontier of 1839 ran through present-day St. Peter, which was then called the Traverse des Sioux. By land, the shallow, stable riverbed allowed horses and wagons a safe crossing. By water, it allowed travelers to reach dozens of tributaries from southern and western Minnesota. Because of this, Nicollet spent 7 days at the Traverse des Sioux, meeting men from his previous expeditions, receiving news, and resupplying for the final leg of his trip. As it transitioned from a fur trade outpost to a city, the first name of the town was Rock Bend, but since the Minnesota River was called the St. Pierre, Rock Bend took the name St. Peter. Captain William B. Dodd, the founder of St. Peter, designed the city streets with plans on it becoming the state capital. 48 hours made all the difference. Politician Joe Rolette had a bill for the governor to sign, but when he was waylaid, folks from the village of St. Paul managed to steal the honors. Along with being the site of the 1851 Traverse des Sioux Treaty, St. Peter also remained a steamboat depot for immigrants to the end of the century.
In late September, Joseph Nicollet returned to Fort Snelling for the 5th and final time. His 1839 expedition was by far the longest, but Nicollet still had data from the other 4 trips: the 1836 trip to the upper Mississippi, the 1837 trip to Madeline Island, the 1838 trip to the Coteau of South Dakota, and the 1838 trip to the Undine and Spirit Lake, with wagons of botanical and geological specimens, as well as his cartography and anthropological studies. Nicollet left Sibley on September 28, 1839, to return to Washington, D.C., where he would become a scientific and social celebrity for the next several years. Yet it was his map of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas that would leave his name a permanent part of history.